So, thank you to the National Museum of Columbia and the U.S. Embassy and other organizers. It's really an honor for me to be here today with you as you embark in a very important project. Uh, my name is Richard Curran from the Smithsonian Institution, a place where I've worked for now 45 years. Um, the Smithsonian has been around for 175 years and has a long and interesting history and relationship with Columbia that we're very proud of. Um, a unit that I've directed in the past, the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, through its Folklife Festival, featured Columbia on the National Mall, the culture and traditions of Columbia. And then I remember in 1992, we did a wonderful program looking at Maroons and the history of Maroonage in the Americas, and had a number of palenqueros from Colombia performing and talking about their history and culture at that festival. Colombia also strikes me in a personal way. My daughter, too, is an anthropologist, as am I, and she really got interested in the cultures of the Andes after seeing an exhibit about Colombia at our Natural History Museum, a museum that was headed by Christian Samper, who is Colombian and later became the acting secretary and is a good friend and colleague. So very deep and good ties with Colombia personally and institutionally. So let me talk about our recent project of bringing the National Museum of African American History and Culture to life. This is a major, major undertaking for an institution. And just like you're grappling with the creation of an Afro-Colombian museum, what I want to do is tell a story of how this museum came to be and why. So currently, for those of you who've visited Washington, this is what the National Mall of the United States looks like. Our US Capitol building in the east, the Washington Monument, that big obelisk in the center, the memorial to Abraham Lincoln in the distance in the west. And the National Mall, this is called, is surrounded by the National Museums of the United States, many of them anyway, that comprise the Smithsonian Institution, the National Museum of Natural History, National Museum of American History, the various art museums, and so on, National Gallery of Art as well. Our latest museum is this museum. It's a little different than the others, and this is our National Museum of African American History and Culture. And this opened in 2016 on the National Mall, in line with other buildings, near that monument to our first president, George Washington. Now, the history of the institution, and even indeed the museum, it goes back really to our founding. So the Smithsonian was founded in 1846, and this was the headquarters, the Smithsonian Castle, and it stands today. And I'm happy my office is in there, and the head of the Smithsonian, the secretary, sits in that office as well as the leadership, and it's somewhat become an iconic building and landmark in Washington. It was the first real building on what we call our National Mall in Washington. And that building was actually built with red sandstone, and the labor for that building, for our National Museum, for the Smithsonian Institution, came from largely African Americans. Some were free, some were enslaved. They worked on cutting that stone that formed our very Smithsonian Castle and headquarters. The Smithsonian itself, this is a map of downtown Washington from the time. You see the Capitol building, and designated there, the Smithsonian is just there to the west, to the left on your screen. And just across the street from the Smithsonian Castle were slave pens, basically places where people, African Americans, were kept as slaves. And some of them were rented out, and some were rented out to help build and landscape the Smithsonian. When the Smithsonian building was done in 1855, it looked like this. And you see on one side of the screen collections, the various collections that came to the Smithsonian, largely from the government of the United States. And those were put in cases, and people came to the museum and enjoyed looking at those objects in cases. Not a lot of context behind them, but kind of old-fashioned mid-19th century museum. And the Smithsonian had laboratories where several scientists worked. It had an art gallery depicted in the other graphic as well. During that time, in the 1840s and 1850s in the United States, there was tremendous debate, as we know, about the nature of human beings. The idea of various races, of civilization, of the progress, and later, after Darwin and Spencer and others, the evolution of mankind. And we know there were a lot of typologies made about how different skull types and skin colors and physical characteristics mirrored a moral and material progress and ideas about savagery and barbarism and civilization. And of course, at that time, in the 1840s and in the 1850s, with Victorian society and the British Empire in its ascendancy, a lot of obvious colonialism around the world, very strong idea of that certain races and people were superior, others were inferior. And so it was really a kind of what we call today scientific racism that really dominated the discourse of ethnology, history, anthropology of the time. We now find much of this discredited, but that was the intellectual fervor of the time. And the idea that were people of one human race, or were there one kind of human species, or were there various kind of human species? Did these evolve, or did species come from, were created by God? So these were the debates of the time. And the Smithsonian existed, of course, at this time and a few years later in the midst of the Civil War, where issues of slavery and freedom and humanity were being debated. The Smithsonian had a magnificent lecture hall. It fit about 2,200 people. The head of the Smithsonian Regents, our governing board, was the Chief Justice of the United States, this rather dour fellow depicted above, Roger Taney. He had ruled on a case in the Supreme Court prior to the Civil War that African Americans could not be citizens of the country. Abraham Lincoln thought otherwise. One of our regents was the leader of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. And as the Smithsonian held debates over the issue of slavery and its abolition, the place of African Americans in the country, a prominent, probably the most prominent scholar, author, and public figure in American life, Frederick Douglass, was supposed to talk in the castle, and the head of the Smithsonian would not let him. And so the Smithsonian developed as the National Museum in much the same way as other institutions did. Some things were collected, some classics, some pictures and postcards, photography of the time, a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation and various books and so on. But by and large, very few African Americans worked at the Smithsonian. A big exception was the fellow depicted on the right, Solomon Brown. But basically, collections did not represent African American life either before the Civil War or pretty much through the rest of the 19th century. In 1915, a historic occurrence happened. It was the 60th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. And this is Washington, D.C. And these are veterans, now quite aged veterans of the Civil War, marching down Pennsylvania Avenue in a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. And of course, in the Civil War, both in the South as well as in the North, and in the North definitively, African Americans fought on the side of the Union. They joined the Army, and they helped win the war that settled the issue of the division of our country, at least at that time. In 1915, African Americans who had fought in the war, who were veterans of the war, were not allowed to march. It was just those people who were white veterans. And so the veterans of the time, African American veterans, came up with the idea of putting together the National Negro Memorial. The idea that if they could not be represented in a parade honoring the service of veterans in a war they had fought for and helped win, that they needed to be represented somewhere in the memory of our country. And so they formed a committee, formed the idea that there would be a National Negro Memorial, which would function as an archive, a repository, if you will, a museum that would represent African American life. This was a time in our country with the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, a lot of lynching, Jim Crow laws in the United States that mitigated against the participation of African Americans in our civic life, and inculcated other forms of discrimination in schools, employment, housing, and so on. And so this national memorial never happened, never got built, never got funded, never got underway. At the Smithsonian, where our museums were growing and our collections were growing, the daughter of this fellow, Christian Fleetwood, who had served in the Union Army, the Northern Army, had won this medal. It was a Medal of Honor, the highest honor that a soldier could receive. So his daughter brought the medal and said, "My father fought in the Civil War. Will the Smithsonian take this into its collections?" This was in the 1940s. And the curators in charge at the Smithsonian said, no, African American life is something not worth depicting at a national level. There's very little significance to this. Fortunately, those curators were overruled by the head of the Smithsonian, the secretary, who said, of course, this is worthy of national attention, and we will accept this medal into our collection. And this was at a time where in American life and in the United States, the military was becoming integrated, baseball was becoming integrated with the participation of Jackie Robinson, where integration was starting to happen in various aspects of life in the United States. And this was basically the integration of the museums. By the 1970s and 80s, when I had started at the Smithsonian, there were other scholars, other curators, and people had started collecting and bringing aspects of collection items and stories into the museums. The portrait gallery took in portraits of Martin Luther King and Marian Anderson, the famous singer who was denied singing in Constitution Hall in Washington, but sang on an Easter Sunday at the Lincoln Memorial to a crowd of 75,000 people. Our Museum of Natural History, my colleague Lonnie Bunch, who was the chief curator there, acquired that stand, the luncheon counter that you see behind the fellow with the sign. That was the stand where, famous in the civil rights movement, where students sat down at a counter and asked to be served, where laws about segregation meant that they couldn't be. And, you know, it was a signal moment in our civil rights movement in the United States. And in the museums, we've done programs where people get a sense of that history and that era of what it means, what it meant to be African American and be denied one's rights. Enter this fellow, John Lewis. John Lewis was part of the civil rights movement. He was head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they did freedom rides, they did sit-ins and so on to advocate for African American rights in the 1950s and the 1960s. John became a member of Congress, and he had a great quote: "Never be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble." He wanted to make good trouble. And he felt that within the museums of the Smithsonian, within our art museums, within our history museums, and so on, we weren't doing a very good job of representing African American culture. And we really needed a museum to do that, to give it the strength, to give it the money, to give it the effort, so that there would be a representation realized on a scope that was merited. So he always, every year, would propose to his fellow members of Congress legislation for an African American museum. It was always shot down. It never succeeded because there were powerful senators from the South who did not want to see an African American museum on the National Mall of the United States at the Smithsonian, and so the legislation did not go anywhere. That was until 2003. George Bush was president, and John Lewis was joined by a senator, a Republican senator from Kansas named Sam Brownback. And he was from a religious family. They went back generations. And Kansas was an area during the Civil War which was called Bloody Kansas, because there were many battles between those who believed in slavery and those who believed in freedom. And Brownback believed very much that the humanity of African Americans was not recognized and needed to be. And so he joined with John Lewis, Republican and Democrat, to propose legislation. That legislation went through. George Bush signed it for the creation and establishment of an African American museum. And that was in 2003. And a commission was formed, and people looking at what the museum should be and what it should exhibit, how it should be organized, how it might be funded, where it should be located, and so on. The location of the museum was picked in this spot. As you see, it's a little fuzzy, but down the mall next to the Museum of American History and near the Washington Monument, the monument to the first president of the United States. And so the issue was, okay, we're going to build a structure and a museum over there. But it's hard to have a museum unless you have a collection. And so the first person hired was actually my assistant. But the second person hired was the fellow in the middle of that picture on the right, Lonnie Bunch. Again, Lonnie had been chief curator over American history. He's a historian. He was hired as director, and he said, I need a collection. And so he went around the country, around the United States, asking people and communities for items that documented African American life. Many people had these items. They had them in their storage, in attics, in basements, in suitcases, in trunks, and on shelves, places that represented the history of their families, of their ancestors, but they'd been reluctant to give these things to any institution because they were worried that they would not represent them well. And now we'd have an African American museum that would help represent the community. Now, Lonnie Bunch was very clear in articulating the purpose of the African American Museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. He said it's really not an African American museum. It's an American museum. It's an American museum that tells the story of our country and its people through an African American lens. After all, it wasn't Black people that invented slavery. It wasn't Black people that invented discrimination in the Ku Klux Klan. It wasn't Black people that invented lynching and other and Jim Crow laws of discrimination. But really, you would understand the American experience in its highs and its lows, at its best and its worst, through that museum, through that lens of the African American experience. And so he went around with others, with curators as we hired them, and built a collection. Ultimately, when we opened the museum, we had a collection of about 40,000 objects. Not all of them on display, but serving as a base source for the research and documentation of the African American experience in the United States and beyond. We collected some things certainly from the Caribbean, from South America and even from Africa. So all sorts of new collections came to the Smithsonian. And Nat Turner's Bible. Nat Turner had led a slave rebellion in the 1830s in the United States. It was the first kind of really explicit and large scale rebellion against slavery by African Americans. And this was the Bible that he used for his inspiration. It was the gospel hymns of Harriet Tubman, the free papers of a former slave who'd been free, a slave cabin. And one of our favorite objects depicted there, a Tuskegee Flyer. That is, this was an airplane that was used to train Black airmen during World War II in the famed Tuskegee unit. So over time, the idea was to build a museum. Well, to build a museum, you need money. The United States government allocated funding, federal funding for the museum, but said, and you have to raise half the money privately from other citizens, organizations, foundations, and so on. And so that's what we did. There's a board to the museum. On the board were people like Oprah Winfrey, the famed actress and philanthropist. Laura Bush served on the board. The head of Bank of America, the head of Time Warner, the head of Walmart, various other dignitaries, and the idea was to raise a lot of money. So a lot of the work of the museum wasn't only collecting and objects and telling the stories, but also collecting the money that would make it possible. In the end, Lonnie Bunch, the director of the museum, Oprah and team and the board raised over $400 million. And some, like this big oversized check from this church, came from grassroots communities who felt they had a stake in supporting the museum. During the time of planning and raising the money and coming up with the collections, the museum still did programs to keep the idea of the museum alive as it was being built, because sometimes you declare, okay, the museum's going to be built, and then 10 years later it's built. Well, what's happening in the intervening time, and how do you keep that idea alive and before people so that they could be excited by it and help contribute to it in any number of ways, whether scholarly or with collections or money or support or community events. And so we did various kind of events. Here on the left is Maya Angelou. It was actually the last public appearance, appearing and talking about her life and her poetry. We did exhibits about photography and African-American life in Washington, D.C., a series on our Smithsonian Folkways recordings, on country music, African-American country music, and so on. So the idea was to do a full slate of programs as we were planning and building the museum. If you're going to build a museum, you need architects. The lead architect was David Adjaye, a person originally from Africa, living in England, but really an innovative, young, creative architect. And we joined him with Phil Freelon and Max Bond, very experienced architects in the United States. And they came up with the design and the plans. And the basic design came really from inspiration. I'd say there was two. One, this sculpture, you see this Yoruba sculpture, and the idea of that tiered corona, that crown, as a kind of pattern. And then also the idea of exuberance in dance. There's a very strong tradition in African American life of praise dance, where people raise their arms outstretched, and it's that kind of same angle out that gives the idea of praise and exuberance and hope and looking toward the sky. And so we did a groundbreaking for the museum in 2012. I had the honor to participate in that, and President and Mrs. Obama presided over that. Laura Bush spoke, John Lewis, Lonnie Bunch, of course, and others. and to get more support as we broke ground to build a museum. And this is what the ground looked like. We basically building the museum next to the Washington Monument. I was worried every day for years that we'd make the hole and then the Washington Monument would fall in the hole, that somehow we would disturb its foundation. Fortunately, that did not happen. But this museum was built to go down, it goes down 80 feet below the surface of the ground. And actually, we had to build the museum in essentially a bathtub because the water table was only 8 feet down. So we have constant pumping to keep the water out. But the idea of going down was actually in accord with the nature of the museum, which I'll explain in a minute. The museum had a lot of symbolic aspects to it. It had a front porch, the idea that African American life in the United States, a lot of people like to sit on their front porch, and the notion of water here represented by this flowing pond, but the idea of journeys over water for African Americans, tying in to the notion of the slave trade. For the dressing of the museum, David Adjaye, the architect, loved this idea of doing it in this filigree pattern of metalwork, which you see in New Orleans in the United States, you see in Charleston, South Carolina, and it was the idea of paying homage to African American artistry and not making this building look like just another official Washington building. And then the museum opened in 2016 in a grand celebration televised around the United States and many parts of the world, and with speeches by various people. And I think one of the most memorable moments of the opening ceremony was this picture that then went many places and has since been repeated and copied, of Michelle Obama hugging George Bush, because it was really the Bushes signing the legislation, President Obama seeing it through, that made this museum happen. And of course, there's John Lewis, who had created good trouble in helping to establish this museum in the background. The museum has always been crowded. Its first year, it saw almost 3 million visitors. And that's only because we could have had 6 million, but the usual stay in a museum is about 2 hours, we find, but people actually stay in this museum 4 hours and 5 hours because there's so much to learn and so much to get out of it. It's so inspiring. Of course, the museum deals with the legacy of African and transatlantic slave trade, slavery in the Caribbean, in the Americas, in Brazil, in the United States, and other parts of the Western Hemisphere, and draws our attention to that. But it also deals with the paradox of liberty, the fact that we had slavery in the United States and we found a country declaring all men are equal. That's a profound, as we know, a profound paradox that even is with us today. And so in the main hall of the museum, the History Hall, you actually go from slavery toward freedom. That's why we dug it so low. So you start out with slavery at the bottom and you move up. You move from slavery to the Declaration of Independence, the founding of the United States, and then up toward the present day and toward increasing freedom. In this display of freedom, it recognizes Frederick Douglass, also Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian independence leader who both enabled freedom and the abolition of slavery in Haiti, something well before the United States. The museum you really walk through history, so all those artifacts that were collected by the museum staff to tell the story of America through colonialism, through the Civil War, through Reconstruction in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and telling the story both in terms of national life and local community life. And then upstairs in the museum, the bottom galleries are the history galleries where you walk up from slavery to freedom. They're rather chronological. And then in the top parts of the museum, there's 3 floors that look at community life, military, sports, entertainment, and culture. So they're more thematic. And in the military gallery, there's a uniform of a friend of mine who recently passed away, Colin Powell, the first African American chief of staff, first Secretary of State, African American Secretary of State, and a statesman widely respected. And he was on the board of the museum as well and donated a uniform. And he used to joke, he said, I can't fit into that uniform anymore. He was a pretty amazing person. In the culture galleries, a lot of inspiration and imagery and music, and looking at everything from Black Hollywood and entertainment to sports, and telling the story of Muhammad Ali and Jesse Owens and Willie Mays and Hank Aaron and various African American athletes, men and women, who really made a mark on their sport, not only for their sporting accomplishment, but like Jackie Robinson, who spoke for justice and integration. And this statue depicts the Olympics from Mexico City, where African American athletes raised their fist in an assertion of their rights and dignity. The museum is equipped not only with artifacts, but with digital interactives, so that people can literally sit at that lunch counter that had to be integrated, a segregation of the 1960s, and sit at that lunch counter and look at what it was like to be there when the civil rights movement was happening. The museum has a wonderful auditorium for films, film premieres and programs, speeches, gatherings, celebrations, and so on. And it has a contemplative hall where people come. We find so many people find the experience at the museum almost like a pilgrimage. And it's very moving, and it really rattles the heart of many people, touches the heart of others, that, seeing this experience of hundreds of years played out through the museum exhibit, people take it very viscerally. It's become quite an experience. So many people seek solace and just a time to decompress in this room. We continue to collect items at not only the African American Museum. I think recently, if you remember the film Black Panther, collected a lot of the costumes for that. But other places and other museums of the Smithsonian continue to collect. The National Portrait Gallery has collected the portraits of President Obama and Michelle Obama. The museum, interestingly enough, is not only a history and culture museum, but plays a role in contemporary civic society. And so when the United States was overcome with protests and events reflecting on police brutality, like in Ferguson, Missouri, the head of the museum, Lonnie Bunch, said, we have to do something. This museum educates historically, but we have to educate also right now, today, in what's happening in America. And so the museum started a training program for police to come to the museum, to take training in African American history and culture, to understand the experience and understand the people and the communities they were policing for. And many police officers, police forces from across the United States came to the museum to learn. To me, that was just a major, major contribution. Of course, life goes on. It doesn't stop at any time. And so as the United States experienced the tragic events with George Floyd, the killings of African Americans, of Black men, the rise of Black Lives Matter, these things, are part of social movements today in the United States. And the museum collects them. They collect these signs and T-shirts and placards and so on that document contemporary life and the contemporary story. Lonnie Bunch did such a great job with this museum that he was then selected as the Secretary of the Smithsonian. And here's the Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, giving Lonnie the key to the Smithsonian. And the fact that you could have in the Smithsonian Institution 160 years ago the Chief Justice of the United States denying African Americans could be citizens of the United States, denying Frederick Douglass, an African American, the ability to speak at the Smithsonian. And here we are almost 2 centuries later, embracing Lonnie Bunch as the secretary and our leader. Of course, it's not always easy, and it's not always in one direction. And so go back to events of just this past year in the United States. Here's the museum, and here's Confederate flags, and demonstrations against the government, against lawful transfer of power, and indeed full of racism and vitriol in the shadow of the African American Museum. We continue to produce products, and recent one that we just put out was the Smithsonian Anthology of Hip Hop and Rap, a phenomena that comes out of a marginal community in the South Bronx in New York in the United States and grows to worldwide popularity. And so we continue to document, represent, and educate about the forms of culture that is still being created today and will be created tomorrow. And we have a new exhibit over in the African American Museum as we speak called Reckoning, looking at protest, defiance, resilience. And so the museum goes from the deepest past, centuries and centuries, five centuries of African American presence in the Americas up to today. And so the Smithsonian and the museum have a continuing role to play in understanding our society and our relations. And that is the story of how we got to this new museum on the National Mall of the United States, an African American museum next to the monument of George Washington, the first president of the United States. Thank you.